in this room. So it's like, you want to be a panelist? No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, any ideas to open it up after one or two questions and like have discussions?
They're just announcing that come in, so we'll wait another minute or two. Folks,
And I will call Louise to see her ETA.
Perfect, yeah.
Do you need me somewhere?
I think that they might struggle to get
The
one to someone
panelists
today
are
because of the
flying
games.
at the other panelists is going to the airport right now.
Okay, yeah, I got you.
Name, number, yeah, there's some in and ask me.
Okay.
Technician Eric.
do you?
Yeah.
Cool, I like to see
He's
it.
left
Same one
me.
you're gonna show us at us?
He's up to us for a little bit.
Okay.
We have time to discuss, like,
You know, get some results first.
There you go.
Shawnee's correct skills, she's
Here.
hungry,
Yeah.
yes, and all of you better translate those for me.
I know, I don't honestly have no idea what we're gonna do then.
So many conferences.
What, I can't do
No, we're trying the
straight
business
environment or
specific.
Okay.
money?
Yeah, just have to do, but it's, stress.
Yeah.
I think you're doing this.
No. I had a very strong workload conversation. I was like, I already work 60 hours a week. I cannot. I will die. I just can't.
Sorry, there's only so many hours. How many
Yeah.
students are there this year?
Yes,
14 is
Really?
yeah.
I love you, Dan.
I'm good.
They're small classes, but
No, but it's not the same.
I think we're
How
gonna
do you know?
stand alone.
Through my work with Fish Wildlife Service, national park service now, many years,
It'd be nice
similar
to
interests.
qualify for
Activism.
Yes. Yeah, we still have to breathe all the way.
Yeah, you too. I recognize her.
I was the president of that for like 10 years, but in 2016 I relocated. I've had fun. I've had fun.
Yeah.
They were just,
I missed the you guys.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
so when I had my kindergarten, I started with about 12
Almost as I still see.
Whitewater, Fairbanks.
Yeah, this whitewater is good. And the downhill skiing, I gotta say.
Yeah. And there's
I lived on Moose Mountain. I can ski up. It's all good. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get going. Thanks everybody for joining our session today on fish, food, and the future. And we have two of our panelists here. Another is en route from the airport, so hopefully she'll find her way here and join us. Originally we also had Craig Chitlook, and he's unable to come, and also Mike Williams is unable to join us. But fortunately, we have Andrew Sear join us and Eric Shane, and I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves and give a little background about their relationship to fish food in the future, and then hopefully then we can have a good discussion. Take it away, guys.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Eric Shane. Oh, thanks. We're supposed to use the mic, even though it's a small room.
You got to kind of hold them up.
I have to turn it on too. Is this working? Yeah, okay. Okay. I'm Eric Shane. I'm a lifelong Alaskan, grew up in Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. And I started fishing when I was a little kid off the beach in front of our house in Juneau. Have eaten Alaskan fish my whole life, and now I'm delighted and privileged to be able to have a freezer full of sockeye that my family and I caught in the Copper River dip netting. Some more sockeye that we buy from a friend who commercial fishes out of Kodiak, and then an occasional king salmon that we catch hook and line in Prince William Sound. And I've had the good privilege of having subsistence donated to my family from friends, including a couple years ago when I was recovering from a serious brain injury, and my friend gave me some Yukon chum and some Yukon king salmon, which are just full of those delicious omega-3s. So I think that's part of the reason I'm here today is my brain got rebuilt with some delicious Yukon River omega-3s. So yeah, fish are really big part of my life. I think they're really interesting to study, and my research involves environmental change, so climate change, landscape changes, things like wildfires and glaciers retreating, and invasive species, and human development. And how do all these changes affect fish populations and aquatic food webs? And in particular, a lot of my research focuses on salmon, but also the predators that eat them, like northern pike and mergansers, burbot and grayling, and also the things that they eat, like aquatic invertebrates. So that's my background, and I was delighted to be invited to be on this panel. Thanks. Oh, and my job now. So my day job, I work at UAF. I'm a research assistant professor at the International Arctic Research Center.
This work? Okay, that's going to be hard to follow. So my name is Andrew Sear. I'm not a lifelong Alaskan, but I've been up here more than half my life, so I am a transplant. Most of my life I was interested in the intersection between environmental health and human health, and trying to figure out what that meant for career opportunities, for recreation, for how to live my life. So I've traveled all around the state and seen how a lot of food works around the state. I've traveled around a lot of the world. It got my interests kind of narrowed down to what I wanted to do for research. So I eventually made it back to school, where I did a lot of work on mercury in fish, which is a hot topic item that probably everyone here has heard something about. So it interested me enough to go back and really dive deep into that topic, which has subsequently led to my current position as the environmental toxicologist for the state of Alaska. So I work with people like Bob Gerlach in the front here from Department of Environmental Conservation. I work with other groups around the state, and a lot of my work presently is focused on trying to put context and understand environmental contaminants in our food web and the potential for human exposure to those contaminants. And obviously in this state that translates to over half my job, probably 80% of my job is dealing with fish in some capacity. The health benefits, the concerns, where they are, access to them, and a lot of that at this point is now trying to promote fish and try to defend fish consumption from, we've had decades of concern and fear about fish, and so now we're trying to look at fish from a more holistic, i.e. One Health perspective, that if we only look at the negatives, like the contaminants in fish, you're completely missing the perspective of what diet is and what we're consuming and what constitutes a healthy diet. So that's kind of where a lot of my focus is now. And if you get me cornered in a room, I'll talk your ear off about fish and fish consumption. In grad school, I was called the fish guy. So, and I'm the substitute today, so you're stuck with Eric and I.
Well, fortunately, this is all about fish, so I think it's going to be okay. So the format here will be for us to have a discussion and take advantage of the expertise of our panelists. I'll just open up the floor. Does anybody have anything to lead off? And if not, I'd be happy to do so. Okay. Just as kind of an icebreaker here, if you will, what do each of you feel is the greatest concern facing fish availability and the use of fish as food in the future? And do you have any thoughts on how we can address those issues? I'll ask. Either one of you can take that up. So again, what are the greatest concerns that are facing fish availability and use of fish as food in the future, and how might we address those?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, I mean, in Alaska, it really depends on where you live and what resources you have access to. So if you live in a village on the Yukon River and you depend on king salmon and maybe chum salmon too, these last couple of years have just been devastating because a lot of these villages don't have access to marine resources, direct access. They, people can trade, people can travel, but the resources that swim by your village are limited, and if those two particular species don't show up, that's devastating. and we're seeing in the Bering Sea too, these crab stocks collapsing and fisheries completely shutting down. So there's been a lot of turmoil, a lot of disruption in what we're used to being able to harvest, and it's not all bad either. There've been some enormous new opportunities and really good runs. Like last year, Bristol Bay had the highest return of sockeye ever in recorded history, and it was the highest harvest in recorded history as well. It smashed the previous records. And people have done sediment coring in those lakes, and it seems like there's more sockeye returning to Bristol Bay than there have been for thousands of years, like even before commercial fisheries. So it's just these really intense collapses and population crashes, but then at the same time there's new species are moving into new areas. New species can be harvested now. There's salmon being harvested on the North Slope in much greater numbers than was previously seen. Not everyone on the North Slope is happy about that. A lot of, some people see that as a concern or a nuisance. Others see it as a new opportunity. And I would say one of the big, one of the important things to keep in mind is that we can't predict what's going to happen, but things are getting disrupted. Things are going haywire with environmental change, and it's as much as we can as individuals and as members of fishing communities, if we can leave ourselves options open. So if you really like to fish for a particular species, and that species doesn't show up, do you have a backup option? Do you have something else you can fish for? Can you broaden out that portfolio of stocks that you depend on? And obviously that's easier in some communities, like that's much easier in Kodiak or Homer than it is in a village on the Yukon River, on the upper Yukon, where there's only limited numbers of stocks that you can get to. But I would say that's kind of the key question, and I don't really have an answer, but question going forward is how can we keep our options open, and how can regulators too, managers, how can the government, how can community leaders try to set things up so that people have options. They don't get locked in where they say they own a quota for one species and they can't just switch to harvest something else if that one species doesn't show up. So yeah, I guess that's kind of how I would approach that.
Thank you, Eric. Andrew, your thoughts?
So first caveat, I'm not a fisheries manager or fisheries person. I'm a health person. The little bit that I've dabbled with fisheries, climate change and ocean acidification are pretty big influencers to a lot of stocks, as are just general surface water temperatures. So those are probably the only two fisheries type things that I'll mention there, and then that's why we have people like Eric. So in terms of availability, I don't have, I'm not going to speak too much to that, but in terms of availability on your dinner plate when people are concerned about fish, we know across a lot of the world, particularly in Alaska, we know that we've seen a decrease in fish consumption over the last, definitely measured over the last 30 years, maybe even 40 years. And so as people are eating less and less fish, we're starting to see other related health problems. So my concern about availability is that going forward, if fish fear continues without the right context and without the right information, and people are avoiding fish going forward, that's my concern for health and for availability. Where I would like to see that trend reverse, where if you have access to fish, that should be a primary component of your diet, not the other way around. And then people like Bob Shop and Eric and other people that we work with continue monitoring going forward, so that we know if a fish stock becomes a problem for health. But that shouldn't be like fear of fish should not be the number one mantra that we're talking. Health should be one of the number one things, and then, well, as a side topic, maybe we should think about this topic for the future, but some contaminant. But so my thing is just gonna be like ensuring that people are pursuing fish and not avoiding it for the right reasons.
Thank you.
So this comes off of what you're saying, Andrew, and I should preface this by saying I'm not a fish person. I'm a medical sociologist, but I study environmental contaminants and how people perceive them and make decisions around what they eat, specifically methylmercury in fish and seals. And I've heard a lot of similar things around people making decisions and saying that they don't want to eat certain fish or certain parts of fish out of fear. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you think are maybe some your perspectives or on best practices for conveying risks and benefits to fish consumption, or how do we kind of combat this idea that fish is dangerous while recognizing that there can be risks, but there are also immense benefits as well.
So first off, welcome to the bane of my existence, trying to communicate these things. And I'm still learning how to communicate this because this is a very big topic. And I'm kind of narrowed down to a couple things, and the idea that the safety numbers that are in place, the safety levels, whatever acronym you want to apply to it, are established with such an amount of conservancy that it would be challenging to get to the point that is a statistical point of the lower end of a debatable, quantifiable outcome. And so like you're talking like we eat fish over here, like this metric, and if you eat a lot of fish, you might get to this one point on this scale, and this one point on this scale is like some super small statistical measure. So first thing is that the levels that we do have are built with a lot of conservative health ideas in mind already. And some of the other stuff is like with a lot of our fish in the state, you have to eat several hundred pounds per year to move the needle of your personal mercury level to even get close to moving the needle of what's considered an adverse effect. So first off, right there, that eliminates 90% of the population. Like even high-end consumers in the state are eating several hundred pounds, like max, but people aren't eating 1,000 pounds of fish in the state. Like that's, who eats 3 pounds of fish a day? Like, it just doesn't happen, right? And I have one other thing on that.
What was I gonna say about?
What your alternative are you going to consider?
Yeah. So so Bob's my real life mentor here to keep me in line. So when we talk about health, we're talking about all this like, One Health, mumbo jumbo, everything's related, right? But in terms of human health, when we often talk about human health and contaminants as a siloed concept, and we talk about contaminants, risk. And so when that's the mantra, we often forget about what the health benefits from a fish are, from any fish really. And so people get scared of fish, and then if you're in Village, Alaska, obviously your food options are limited. So what are your alternatives going to be? Regardless of what your alternatives are going to be, they're probably going to cost more money, and I will guarantee that they're going to be less nutritious. And the dirty secret that is never really publicized is that a lot of the alternatives still contain a lot of these same contaminants. And so people don't want to talk about that. We can talk about PCBs. You can look at a lot of PCBs in grocery store food items like chicken, eggs, butter. A lot of those grocery store food items have more PCBs than Alaska salmon. So it's like, yeah, like these contaminants exist, but the alternatives also have a lot of these contaminants and aren't as nutritious. So I think framing it from the perspective of like nutrients and balance and economics, culture, spirituality, like all of those things that we've been talking about are all part of a healthy fish diet. And I can assure you, people like Bob and I are behind the scenes studying all these fish to make sure we identify a problem before it becomes a problem. So, but yes, I mean, I've been trying to figure out the cleanest way to convey this to the public, and yeah, it's a challenge. So if you find a clean way that really cuts through the jargon, please let me know.
I think Andrew made a good point when you think about those alternative foods. I mean, somebody came and they were doing a study on fish. It was a national study, so they came up here and they were looking at, and they said, well, we should be telling people to eat Alaskan wild fish because these farm salmon, look at their PCB levels. They're up here and they're twice as high as wild salmon. And I thought, well, you're missing the point, because if you look at dairy products, I mean, I can't even put them on the same scale. And so, are dairy products bad? They've got a PCB, and the PCBs are unfortunate consequence of worldwide distribution and long-term chemicals that are there. So it's the concept that Dave and Arlie are trying to go ahead and push here, is that it's a One Health concept. And so when you think of your foods, it's an ecosystem concept that you got to keep approaching. And it's really difficult for somebody, an educator like you, to go ahead and get that into a 30-second soundbite so people will go ahead and retain it and listen. And that's extremely challenging. But I mean, I think I've learned a lot from folks like you to go ahead and say, well, this is the challenges we have. And it makes you stop and think and maybe reassess what we should be doing too.
If I might follow up on that quickly. So when I take mercury as an example, I'd like to know more about, well, what are the trends in mercury burdens in fish? Are they going up or down, or are they stable? What are the sources of that mercury, to understand those cycles? And part of the One Health framework is that environmental health, and I work a lot in that environmental health part of that triad. Are there things we can do globally, nationally, locally to ease those burdens? Because we can't assume that things are going to stay stable and just come up with a simple message. We need to work towards healthy foods and healthy choices. Can you comment, perhaps you or any of the panelists, on the trends in environmental mercury and mercury burdens in fish, and what the sources of that are?
Well, I work specifically on understanding perceptions of methylmercury in relation to hydroelectric projects. So that's like a very specific kind of case study that I work on. But the problem that we have, or that the issue, is that there's also, I work in indigenous communities, a lot of lack of trust with the research that's done, or like the government agencies that are monitoring it. So that's another level there where, a lot of complexities around measuring and monitoring and trusting those numbers.
I live in Montana, and every time I go to Missoula, I see a train that goes to the vanishing point, coming from East Montana full of coal, and it's headed to China. Every day, several of these trains roll through. This is just from one mine. And I've seen wind maps of where the mercury comes back. And so we're shipping out the coal and the mercury is coming back. So I don't think there's much argument as to where the mercury is coming from. And I learned this valuable thing during the 2008 campaign, that China is building and bringing online a coal-fired power plant every 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks. Now maybe they're not doing that anymore. But I think definitely coal is one issue. But having said that, I live on a reservation that has control of the southern end of Flathead Lake that's full of lake trout. And they're actually seeing a trend, if they can believe their data, they're still wondering if they can believe the data, of the mercury in the lake trout going down.
Going what? I'm sorry.
Down,
Down.
which would be unexpected. So obviously this is a complicated issue, but what in living systems isn't a complicated issue. But, anyway, that's a lot of coal.
Yeah.
That's a lot of coal. And we're
Thanks
not the only
for
state
sharing.
supplying coal to China.
That, yes, Doug hits it right, like parts of it right in the head. Like, I think I don't know what I've seen variable estimates, but it's definitely over 50%, maybe upwards of 80% of atmospheric mercury emissions come from coal. There's a lot of other things, industry, volcanoes, blah blah blah, but coal consumption is a big driver. And yeah, I've seen other trends showing mercury levels starting to trend down, but depending on how you look at a lot of meta-analyses, and some regions are trending up, some are down. The overall trend across everything they think is slightly trending down. Coal emissions are lower than they were in the 70s and 80s nowadays, so like we have that going in our favor at least. But then once you get into like a local food web, there are a myriad of drivers that influence mercury, from local conditions, deposition, geology, water conditions, pH, UV, or dissolved organic matter, and then what fish protein, feeding ecology. And then there's a whole slew of influences that dictate how much mercury is going to be in each fish at each different age, in each different water body. And that's when you start getting into the complexities of what people like Bob are trying to do and provide fish guidance and how to work with these numbers to provide some sort of comprehensive but easy to understand message.
And maybe the conversion rate is going down on the microbiological level, I don't know.
No, I think it's actually going the opposite way. Up here, it's going up because we're seeing more wetlands and then more conversion. But one of the points you made is that coal's coming from the United States and going to China, which is by far a great improvement from China using its own coal, because it's got the highest contaminant levels of their natural coal, has the highest contaminant levels of mercury, arsenic, and several other heavy metals. So them to use an alternative form. And it's kind of what Dave was mentioning is, what things can we do to mitigate this? And you think, well, you're not going to change China from going from coal power to something else, not overnight. So what can you do to go ahead and decrease that? Use an alternative source maybe to go ahead and do immediate addressing, and then long-term wise, what can we do to go ahead and induce that? But you're right, those plumes coming over, and the work that we've done with in the 1970s, it was mercury content in fish, in halibut, was the lowest it had ever been was in the Bering Sea, and then it would progressively go up until you got down off of the coast of the northwest area of the lower 48. Then all of a sudden we're starting to watch and get in Andrew's group, because we didn't understand what was happening. We were starting to see pretty high levels of mercury in halibut on the far end of the chain of the Aleutians. And so then Andrews came in, and the research they were doing was looking at the mercury, or looking at the stable isotopes to see, well, if this is, maybe these fish are feeding at a different trophic level. And the big concern we had was that they're feeding at the lowest trophic level, and they have the highest level of mercury. And then you think, well, where's that mercury coming from? I mean, you see that plume coming right across, and it's hitting those. And so and the point you make is right. It's very complex, extremely complex, and it has to be taken from that perspective of Dave's point of what can we do now to mitigate this, and then how can we look at it in the future? And then Andrew, who's left with the dirty work of saying, are they still safe to eat? And you think, yeah, by far, when you look at that, and the work that was done early in Alaska, well, but it was, we looked at saying, here's the consumption rate of some of these tribal communities, 400 to, upwards, and there were some points of even individuals of 600 pounds of fish per person per year. But even if you look at 400, the EPA came up and said, man, even if your fish are that low in mercury, you've got a problem. So public health steps in, and they say, okay, we're going to do a hair mercury study. And so when they did that, they looked at, let's go ahead and look at the proof. And when they looked at the hair mercury of those people that are eating that much fish, their hair mercury level was less than the mercury level of the people in the lower 48 that are eating 16 pounds of fish per person per year. So you think, that's what Andrew's looking at. Well, why? And you think, well, there's other things, there's other nutrients in that fish that are going to go ahead and balance things out. And the work that Andrew and some of the folks in, well, Buck Fearon in our office is looking at is we know that selenium does bind with mercury. And is that the process that makes that good? And so when you look at ocean fish that are high in selenium, well, you've got a really good thing going on. And do we have to reassess then what that mercury level is in that fish and what's that negative impact? And that's when the health folks are, like I said, they're left with that
You're saying
challenge.
the hair mercury was less?
Yeah, was less.
Because even like in the Seychelles studies where they had high selenium fish, the hair mercury levels were still sky high. even
And
though they were
there's a
so
little bit
healthy.
difference in the Seychelles because there was a lot more consumption of marine mammals. And that's what was driving a lot of the mercury issue was the marine mammal consumption. It's, I mean, way above my intelligent level to go ahead and figure it out. That's why we work with Andrew to go ahead and tell us what we're doing right and wrong.
But even the Seychelles, their hair mercury was definitely not sky high. It was definitely elevated compared to what we've seen, but it was still low in terms of neurological effects, and the number of types of neurological exams that they were giving to the patients and for those fish consumers. I think they did something like 19 different neurological exams, and most of them came out, all but one came out as people who ate more fish had a better, more positive neurological outcomes. And that's the other side of the coin, is that just because we can measure it in your hair doesn't mean that it has an adverse effect. And that's the other side of the coin that I have to dig deeper in to try to understand the nuances of these studies. And that was one of them. Is like, yeah, people who, especially like parents or mothers that ate fish during pregnancy, those children were born with better immune systems, better neurological development, better eyesight, better hand-eye coordination, like all these different things. So that's the other side of the coin, is like, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, we can start throwing all these numbers at people, but then you're just throwing facts around, it doesn't matter. So, but yeah, end of the day,
Put out there, fish is good food.
fish is good. Come talk to the fish guy, he'll tell you that.
There you go, you got it. 9 words.
Please.
I just was curious, and you really nailed what I was going for, was that for the testing. And so I'm just curious, is that an ongoing, or do we do that, like, we're measuring all the time the fish and that impact, but are we like being able to take that data and, do the correlation or causation or?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we, my department is doing ongoing hair mercury monitoring. I have kits with me if anybody wants to get their hair mercury tested. I can take samples anytime this week, and we can send them to the lab to get tested at some point in the next couple months. So that is ongoing, and we are trying to collaborate with some research entities in the state to try to actually do direct consumption surveys in communities with pie in the sky dream of doing neurological exams on fish consumers down the road. But that's an Andrew dream, not a reality right now. But yeah, we are doing ongoing monitoring. Yep, it's up and running, and so if anyone's interested.
Why don't we, are there any other thoughts on the mercury issue or contaminants in general? Yeah.
It's not specifically on this, but just, Andrew, you were mentioning the difficulty in messaging, and I'm sure you know this, but there's lots of other issues that are similar to that, and so I work on harmful algal blooms, and we do kind of get into that same situation where you try and strike that balance between information and alarming, right? And so I think there's a space that needs to be created for these different topics, or these different this topic to be discussed from these different perspectives, from the fish mercury, from the shellfish PSP aspect, from I'm sure a few others, and maybe maybe there's a way for us to kind of all talk together and share ideas about how we can discuss these types of food-based, for lack of a better word, pathogens or threats, and how do we talk about them in a succinct, clear way that's both informative and and it'll be different for different topics, different specific topics, but I think there's definitely a space there for us to talk about how we can do that better together.
I think that's actually absolutely perfect because, I mean, I sit at a desk all day, and so I'm not talking with fish consumers every day. I'm a fish consumer, and I talk with a lot of people, but I'm still sitting at a desk, and there are people sitting at desks elsewhere, and there are people out in the field doing things, and how often we come together and who's discovered a new communication tactic. Of course, on top of all that is how quickly fear spreads, right? An alarming news title will spread infinitely faster than like some banal title like, oh, new study finds fish are healthy for you. Like, yeah, we know that, but that's not going to spread versus someone who puts out a title about, is that fish killing you? Like, I mean, I've seen titles like that in the last 2 months, and those spread much faster than any topic of any like title about a nuance or, oh, well, who cares about something is good for me? What don't I want to eat? So, yeah, we're always trying to balance those two worlds.
I think it's what's going on this weekend with that prioritization workshop is really good because you think about all the contaminants we're worried about from HABs and from mercury and from PCBs, from PFAS, and you think, you guys get this long list and you think, we need to prioritize what we're dealing with in the state of Alaska with our resident fish, and then go ahead and take that message forward and exchange ideas of how we can cross-communicate and get that message out. And I think that's one way, because if you start to go ahead and make a program for each of these, like I said, the money gets divided up so fast, and if we can prioritize, I think you'd be, your benefit for your buck is going to be really increased.
Yes, sir.
I got a question, one for each of you. On the fish health issue, and whether or not fish are good for you and stuff, they tried to convince us years ago in the Yukon not to eat fish because of mercury or something like that. I wasn't about to go eat Doritos or something like that, okay? I stayed with the fish, and I fished my whole life, but the question is has there been any studies about the long-term health of the fish themselves? We've seen them change size greatly during this time period. Are there mineral deficiencies in the fish, or I saw increased disease in the fish, ichthyophonus and that sort of thing. So that's my question for you. I know that the fish are still healthy to eat and everything, but is there, maybe you could talk a little bit about research there.
That's an excellent question, and I will immediately defer to fish ecologists and biologists. I know there's definitely some research that's been done on like the age cohorts and the size of fish that are coming back, and so I'm pretty sure Eric might chime in on that one. In fish health in general, in relation to contaminants, what I have read and what I've seen in that particular specific sphere is that the level of contaminants that we're seeing in the majority of wild-caught Alaska fish are not detrimental to fish health. Now that might change in like a site-specific concern, maybe like next to a dump site or effluent or something like that. And those are like really site-specific things that would require a different kind of question and answer.
And the question I had for Eric was about, you had mentioned briefly earlier about the lake core testing for the salmon runs in Bristol Bay.
Yeah.
Is there a map, or is there some kind of mapping that's gone on for looking at fish populations over time through these different lake systems, like Teslin Lake in the Yukon, or other places like that, so we can have an idea about how much used to come to different areas and that sort of thing in a mapping kind of way?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not I'm not aware of a map like that. There have been a number of studies, and most of this happens with sockeye salmon because they tend to rear in lakes. So it's much harder to do this type of work in a river where you're not going to have sediments building up consistently over time. But yeah, there have been a lot of studies in sockeye lakes around Alaska, and then in the Pacific Northwest and other places. I'm not aware of any. So up in the Yukon, where it's mostly king salmon, I'm not sure if there are paleolimnological studies that have been able to quantify the number of kings returning over centuries. Because they just return in such smaller numbers, and they generally don't go to lakes, although some of them do. To your question about fish size, so yeah, salmon are getting smaller throughout Alaska, throughout the North Pacific, and that's been linked in part to climate change, but more so due to just the numbers of salmon in the ocean. So there's more salmon in the Pacific Ocean now than there ever have been in recorded history, and that's partly due to wild pink and chum salmon and sockeye being conditions are really good right now. If you look at the big scale across the North Pacific for pink and chum and sockeye, and there's a ton of them. And then it's partly due to hatchery production. So the countries around the Pacific Rim release 5.5 billion salmon into the ocean every year from hatcheries. And the United States, Alaska in particular, is the biggest producer of pink salmon from hatcheries, and Japan's the biggest producer of chum salmon. And then Russia and Korea and the lower 48 and Canada produce a measurable number too. And there's mounting evidence that there's a trade-off there. I mean, those hatchery fish, they support commercial fisheries. They're worth a ton of money. They really help keep coastal economies going through ups and downs of wild stocks. They feed a lot of people. I'm definitely not a hatchery basher in the least. It's a nuanced question, but there's also a trade-off for sure. So wild runs, the salmon are getting smaller because there's only so much food out there in the ocean, and if we put more mouths out there competing for the same food, nobody can get quite as big as they used to. To your question about fish health, as far as disease, we have an expert on that in the room, Dr. Morag Clinton. Sorry to put you on the spot, Morag. Would you like to? She just gave a really good seminar on this a couple weeks ago at UAF.
Yeah, sure. Hi, nice to meet everyone. I'm Dr. Morag Clinton. Yeah, you said my trigger word, so it was perfect. Fish disease. Yeah, I don't research mercury specifically, but my understanding is that a lot of the levels within our different fish stocks are due to this bioaccumulation, and levels in salmon specifically are not terribly high, but levels in things like northern pike can be really high, and of course mercury is an immunotoxicant. So we are actually really interested in the question as to what things like contaminants are doing to disease resistance, and this. Thank you. Yes, I'm not the loudest presenter. Yes, we are really interested in what mercury is doing to disease resistance in species such as northern pike and its kind of immunotoxic effects, and just kind of these bigger, broad health questions as well. With thermal stress, disease tolerance is reduced, and we do see sort of more disease outbreaks. And speaking to the example that you made with Ichthyophonus in the Yukon Chinook, there's probably a number of factors that are driving the emergence again of this disease within that population, and it's all of these compounding stressors. So kind of a wishy-washy answer in that we can't rule contaminants out at all, but certainly within salmon, probably less significant, but in some of these sort of longer-lived species or apex predators and things, contaminants are potentially a factor in these disease outbreaks, and it's really hard to test, and that's really what we're grappling with in our research group at the moment, trying to perform good, nuanced research where you can actually test the impacts of these things within population when there's so many compounding factors. Yeah, I can't remember anything else. Did you have anything else that you wanted to?
Oh, I have lots. I'm like these guys. I could talk fish all day. I guess I have one more question since we're at it.
Can we pass the mic?
Thank you so much.
Oh, I got to be mic. Okay, my other I can't hear, so. The, years ago, and I'm from Fort Yukon, I've been fishing for king salmon and chum salmon my whole life, as well as whitefish, variety of different kinds of whitefish. The question I have is about, has there been any change in how science is pursued in relation to indigenous people? Has that been a discussion in your fields? You know, when about 15 years ago, some scientists came to Fort Yukon and they did an adipose fin study and scale study. And I was a part of that study. They, asked us to collect scales from each salmon and collect the adipose fin from each of these salmon. And then we're like, oh, okay, great. We could do this for you. We'll gather this data for you. And so, every day, like twice a day when I check my net, I'd get this data for these scientists. And then we dutifully sent them off in these little bins. We never heard anything again. Right? We never heard any information about whatever happened to these fins, whether it was even processed or whether it was received, or any kind of information about that kind of study. And so that was my personal experience. It kind of colored how I view what's going on with scientists, right? So it's we hear the information. When it's kind of generally reported out, has there been any kind of reflection within the field about how you guys gather data with indigenous communities and so forth? Is it, has there been any discussion about more transparency or co-production of knowledge, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that story of scientists, Western scientists, parachuting into a community, asking for help and extracting knowledge, and then taking it and doing, using it to publish papers, further their careers, but not returning to benefit the local community. I think that has been so widespread, and it's really it's a harmful and lasting legacy of Western science in general. My institution, the University of Alaska, has engaged in that type of work in the past. I can say definitely things are changing, and this is a huge topic of discussion. It's one of the hottest topics in Alaska fisheries science right now, is how co-production of knowledge, how can indigenous perspectives be intertwined with Western science, not as a, let's cite one elder to confirm what I already want to say with my data, or let's, people are being pushed really to engage with indigenous communities and local communities, which may or may not always be indigenous, but engaging with communities not just when it's time to collect the data or when it's time to publish, but throughout the research process. So in the process of formulating a research question, writing a grant, deciding who's going to get the funding from the grant. Is it all going to go to the university, or is it going to be distributed, to local communities as well? Who gets on the papers? Whose name gets, on the paper that gets published? How does the information get distributed back? That the best practices now are really, there's this hierarchy of levels of engagement and co-production, and I guess within the university at least, it's seen as people are impressed if you work really hard to work at a higher level of engagement, and working with, even to the point of working with communities to say, hey, we have this skill set, we have these tools, would you be interested in collaborating with us? Does your community have any questions that you're interested that we could help address with these tools that we can bring to bear at the university? So, so there's a speaker, Dr. Jessica Black from UAF, is speaking at this conference. She's also a keynote speaker at a fisheries conference that I'm chairing at the end of the month. And she's a leader in this. She and her colleagues have this NSF-funded program called Tamunta, which means all of us, and it's really focused on advancing indigenous indigenizing salmon science in particular and salmon management. So yes, that's a great question, and I definitely wouldn't say that the problem is solved. I think the problem totally still exists, and people still need to push and keep working on that. But that conversation is definitely happening.
I was just going to say one thing about the the impact of the toxins on the fish, and I think it's great that you're doing that work and that research, and the work that they've done with songbirds on the East Coast, the Northeast. They found that higher levels of mercury in those populations, they were seeing a decrease in the population of the birds. So they went back and looked at that and found that these birds had significantly elevated levels of mercury, and it impacted not just their immune systems, but the behavior. And so they weren't as effective as finding a mate. The females weren't as productive as laying enough eggs, and they didn't take care of the chicks. And so overall, the populations were really down diving. And the one thing that I'm glad that they stopped and looked at, and not just said it was mercury, because there's other contaminants too that can have an impact. And that's what I think the complexity that your research is working on with the impact on the fish is that you're trying to look at a combination of things and how you can make an association with that. And it's fantastic that the university is doing the work, and I think the fisheries work is just, to me, was really impressive too, because we had the same concern about halibut, and the halibut numbers size at age were really low. And then, we're looking at contaminant levels, and IPHC, or the International Pacific Halibut Commission, was looking at the health of the fish, and it ended up being that it was just that. It was that there was just more fish there. The overall mass of halibut in the ocean was actually increased. It's just that they're getting smaller, but the overall mass of the fish was the same. So it's complex issues to deal with.
I just wanted to interject, it was mentioned, Dr. Jessica Black, she'll be speaking Friday morning in our welcome speech, so something to look forward to. Quitchin. All right, anybody else? Yes, sir.
I could ask this, Andrew, on the side, but we'll throw it out here. Since we talked about climate change maybe affecting the food web a little bit, are you including analysis of EPA and DHA in the fish, or just the mercury? And if you are, have you seen any differences there?
Thank you. That is kind of at the heart of a lot of what Bob's group and I are looking at is, so Doug's question is getting at omega-3s, and he's pinpointing a couple types of omega-3 fatty acids that particularly DHA are very high in marine fish. And so there's, in the contaminant world, particularly like the mercury world, there's this discussion of mercury and selenium and how much selenium has an effect on stripping mercury away and reducing the bioavailability of mercury. And that topic is kind of it's becoming more and more understood. Coupled with that is trying to understand where do omega-3s come into this chemical mixture, to this biochemical mixture, and what's happening within an individual fish, and what's happening through the digestive process when you're taking in a whole slurry of contaminants, but you're taking in things like all these different omega-3s, and how do we quantify how that impacts human health? So there are a lot of epidemiological studies that have been looking at this. There are some in vitro studies that are looking at this. There are supplemental studies that have looked at this. And nothing is necessarily super conclusive yet on like this amount of fish or this amount of DHA equates to this much health benefit yet. But there is at least a concerted effort to discuss incorporating this into consumption advisories and into health metrics. So I don't have any like concrete thing to say about that, but that is a topic that most fish toxicologists and health people are well aware of, and we're trying to navigate how it can be incorporated. And it's as like the state of Alaska is looking to renew or update fish consumption advisories for the state of Alaska and all of our fish. And that's one of the topics we're trying to figure out is like, can we and how, if we were to, how do we incorporate omega-3s into the equation? And if anyone has any fancy model that they can show me, that I would love. In the meantime, I don't know how to incorporate them on a quantitative metric yet.
Well, I was asking if you're actually seeing changes in the amounts in the fish.
Sorry. Bob would be a better person to answer that because I think he's looking at some of that data hot off the presses more than I do.
Yeah, we're just started a new study with ASME, the Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute, where the nutrition data that we have on fish from Alaska is probably about 20 to 30 years old. And so it's taken a long time to go ahead and get together, but we'll be collecting a collection of commercial important species of fish and then expand onto other species as well if the funding continues to go ahead and look at a complete nutrient analysis and then at the same time evaluate the contaminant analysis. And so this will give Andrew more work to do to go ahead and then try to discern that and see through that. We have seen that as climate changes come in and forages have affected fish growth, and that there have been some changes in overall fat content. But our data, we have just some preliminary data on the levels of recently, and I don't have anything historically to go ahead and compare that because it's complicated. I mean, I would be hard pressed. I'd be going toward Eric to ask for help to interpret what's the impact of, because we know when you have an animal that has a lot of fat stores, then their energy is they're in a high energy state, a good body condition state, and in good health. And when the first thing that goes are those fat stores once they start to get stressed. And but like I say, it can, and Eric knows that it can vary according to the season. So if you catch a fish out of season during the winter, man, their body conditions are bad. Contaminant levels are high because their overall muscle mass is low and their fat levels are down. So it's complicated, a lot more complicated than I can understand most of the time.
Dr. Upton.
Thanks. I have two questions. One is there a difference when how you cook or process the fish? Does it change contaminant level or nutrient value of the fish? And then my second question is, as scientists and researchers, what do you think the role is of your institutions and your in advocacy? Like I heard both of you say, eat fish, eat fish, eat fish. And where we come from, we haven't been allowed to fish for the last 3 years. And I really feel like our communities need a lot of backup to say that we get to fish. So I'm curious what you think about that.
All right. So the first question is what we refer to as end of the fork analysis, and so how you process, like actually cook your fish, will impact certain contaminants. So like some forms of mercury will be lowered a little bit at the end of the fork, and then other like lipophilic contaminants, if some of that oil is kind of like grilling, like if some of that oil just drips off, you'll have lower lipophilic contaminants at the end of the fork. Conversely, if you smoke fish, you're adding PHAs to your fish, not at a problematic level, but at a quantitative, like if we're gonna get down to chemistry, you're technically adding a carcinogen to your fish when you smoke your fish. Other elements that we know about are impacted, not at really any level during cooking. Other new emerging contaminants like PFAS topic. PFAS is not impacted through the cooking process, so they're still gonna, if they're there at the front end, they're gonna be there at the back end. particularly since most PFAS are going to be bound to proteins, not to fats. So for the most part, cooking is going to lower contaminants a little bit in fish. It's arguable how much of a difference, but generally that's the general trend through the cooking process. And to your second question, that's an excellent question, a very loaded question that my entire department, we have zero regulatory anything, and we don't make actual decisions. We make recommendations about health. So I can recommend eat fish, and I can tell all the legislators that we need fish and people should be eating fish. But I'm not the person to be making those decisions, other than promoting whatever will happen to ensure that we get fish to communities that actually need them. But that's a much bigger question beyond my simple mind and desk.
Thanks, Andrew. No, I guess obviously that for anybody at a government institution or an academic agency, there's a fine line between advocacy and sticking to the facts or your research, and that applies to everybody. But I guess just on a personal level, I hear you, and that I have a lot of friends and colleagues who live on the Yukon and have been really affected, and they're just hearing stories about my friend who wants to bring her kids to fish camp to learn from their elder who's only going to be around a few more years, and they haven't been able to fish for 3 years, and it's just, she has to decide every spring, am I going to take time off from my office job that pays a salary and take my kids to back home to the village to fish with our elder family members and be able to learn those traditions. But if we do that and we aren't allowed to fish again, it's going to be so depressing to just be there sitting there not able to fish. That's like, it's just so hard to hear, and that I know that really affects a lot of communities. I'm privileged where my family lives in Anchorage. I can go out on my parents' boat and catch a king salmon out of Whittier that probably came from the Columbia River from a hatchery somewhere. I'm not personally affected, or I can go dip net for Copper River Reds by driving from my house. I'm not personally affected at that level, but I hear you. It's a huge humanitarian issue, and that I think a lot of people who study salmon, in particular Yukon River king salmon, but who study fish in general in this state, are strongly motivated by those. This isn't just an interesting academic thing where you can publish in a good journal and get a pat on the back from your colleagues. If you can, the work in this area affects people's lives deeply, and it affects cultures that have been here for 10,000 years, and I think that's a huge motivator for many of us who work in this field. Go ahead.
Can I just follow on from that, because I'm not a researcher, and then just from private, and I have no understanding now of how research all is funded, but I guess to that question of when different scientists or researchers do work, if that is funded by public monies, it's funded by the NIH or through a government institution to whom I pay my taxes, is there not some responsibility then within that, or is it somewhere written that then the responsibility ultimately is that that information is for the public good and therefore should be used for advocacy? Am I making sense? Kind of. And I may just not be understanding the process.
No, yeah, I hear you. I think so. There are rules. If you get NSF or NIH funding, your data is public. It has to be shared in a public repository. So there's, open science rules for sure, and those are important. And we should all be doing our best to abide by those. So publicly funded research is made available to the public. And then I think I guess I'm not sure if there are any rules about whether you should advocate or how much you should. But I think just as a matter of professional responsibility, it's everyone's job who does science to not just publish it and talk to our friends about it and stick to the academia or the journals or the scientific conferences, but figure out how do we communicate this to everybody? How do we say it in a different way? Cut out the nerd talk and make it real, make it, and that's hard. How does your research actually matter in the real world? Sometimes it's really hard to articulate that. It depends on what the question is, but I think everyone who does research it's their responsibility to figure out what's the key take-home message, put it in simple terms, and get it out there, not just in the journal article, but to the broader public. I think that's a really good point. Maury?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to what Eric was saying there, because I totally agree. I think we have a responsibility to responsibly advocate for our science and present our results, because ultimately science has a problem in that a lot of our success is measured in these academic publications and sensationalizing at times the results of our scientific research. And that is a big problem, and I think we've made really positive progress in that area, but I think we can all agree that a lot of the people that go into the STEM subjects, biological sciences, we're not always famous for our social skills. And I just wanted to highlight the role of identifying that personally, and sometimes sharing the load of sharing that science and identifying the people who can responsibly communicate those findings, and working more collaboratively rather than producing the research ourselves and then trying to communicate it ourselves. And we spend all this time writing these very dense, very hard to read scientific publications. They're not accessible. And I think I don't have a question, I'm just rambling. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of talking to people at even these conferences, people who are a lot more adept at communicating this research in a responsible way and not sensationalizing things and presenting things as accurately as we can. And I do think we have a responsibility for that. And the funding agencies do encourage us to do that, but a lot of it, I think, it kind of falls to the level that personally different researchers feel that responsibility, and they don't always receive recognition from it at the university level, which I think can be a challenge as well. I think if we were encouraged to do more of this outreach, and actually UAF is pretty good this way, but generally there's room for more, but I'd like to think we're getting better.
I think to further, not expand, but just kind of ramble some more. We're definitely not always socially adept, and in getting the message out is, it'd be nice if we could have a better mechanism to get more messages out in the general media. For example, one of my research chapters years ago was a community-initiated question that was based on a National Geographic article. So they read a National Geographic article about how toxic their town was, and they got really scared and came to us with a question. They wanted to know, what about our food resources? And so we were like, this is what? You want to study this? Well, okay, and then when we found out why, it was from a very sensational, fear-mongering article. It's okay, so why can't we have these sensational, positive-mongering articles that are putting out all these good messages about science, the good science that is being done, but it's challenging. Fear sells quick.
I just wanted to also mention the importance of science communicators, and we have one in the back of the room, Alice Bailey, who works with you.
So I perked up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation. I am a science communicator. The scientists write the papers, but then I have to read them and turn it into something that, not have to, I enjoy reading them, but then I turn it into something that hopefully the public can understand and learn from. So I was thinking when Thomas mentioned earlier the importance of maybe creating a space to have these conversations about messaging, that it would be really great to invite some science commuter type people, like from the media. And I know that there are those terrible headlines, like what you said, and so there's those kinds of reporters, and then there's responsible ones. And I've worked with some great people. And usually if someone is in the field of science communication, they actually are interested in the research, like I know I am. And then so you get the background and you want to understand the context of, like, you know, the whole backstory affects how you write that paragraph and just the tone of it. And so those little nuances can make the difference between somebody completely freaking out when they read it. So yeah, I would just encourage people to engage with science communicators, and then also the graphic designers, because when you're talking about these things, I'm a visual person, so when you're talking about, you know, mercury levels going down, but then when something bonds with it, it goes back, and I'm like thinking of it in a picture. And then, but a picture is something that someone can look at and kind of understand. So yeah, I think it's if those headlines are a problem, like kind of engaging with those people, they're kind of the source of that misinformation. So engaging with folks from the beginning would be great. So.
So I wanted to interject one thing here. You know, I heard two ideas being bantered around here. One is communicating the results of science to diverse audiences, but the other was advocacy, science-based advocacy. And you know, in my education as a scientist is kind of steeped in this idea that scientists are completely dispassionate and completely unbiased, which is BS. No human can be unbiased. We live within ourselves and our shells and our experiences and gain knowledge, and that biases us, I think. But we strive to accurately depict data and analyze data. There's not intentional bias. That said, there is also a role, I think, for scientists as advocates for what the data are showing and understanding what the impacts of that potentially are. But it's a real struggle because scientists, I think, can sometimes lose some credibility with their colleagues and some standing in their profession if they cross over into that role as advocates, however justifiable it may be. And these are just ideas, you know, huge people like E.O. Wilson, you know, wrote about this extensively, you know, world-renowned ecologist that we lost recently. If I might, Eric, your father, John, you know, has been an incredible advocate for things that he dispassionately studied and gained passion for through the work that he did. And so I've often struggled just within myself, and I don't have any answers to this, but I think there is a role for scientists as advocates, but we have to be careful as well. So it can be, I think, frustrating for the people that are funding the research, the American public, when they don't feel like the results of that research are being applied to solutions to the problem. So.
Yeah, I think my main question came from that. My main question came from what my friend here from the Yukon talked about, where there are learnings and so forth, but if it doesn't land on the table at the Board of Fish or at these really decision-making moments, and it's not communicated or it's understood, and I know that's a really complex issue, but it really matters what happens with that information when it comes to people's lives and livelihoods and their culture, and so that's where that's coming from.
Thank you.
I'll add one thing to that, which is I think we can also think about, as scientists, advocacy can be lots of things, and it's not necessarily being an activist, and it might just be the location of where you're sharing your data. And if you share it inside of a legislator's office, you're still just sharing your data. You can be doing the same presentations you had at a scientific conference, but you're doing right in front of a legislator. That is the same action in a different location, that's a way of helping along. And so if somebody goes into a legislator's office and says, here's the health benefits of fish, we should be eating more fish, is that level of advocacy something that you feel like you wouldn't be able to do, Andrew, out of your office? Not to put you on the spot, sorry.
Well, yeah, that's an excellent question. To be totally frank, I'm still learning what I'm allowed to do and not do in terms of advocacy and from a government position. There are definitely quite a few topics where I've wanted to chime in, but I can't. And some of that is I just don't understand the process of politics. And yeah, I don't know what I can do. I mean, thank you. I can look into those types of approaches to actually take my message and put it into a more useful framework. So, I mean, thanks for the heads up and the idea. Yeah.
And kind of to bring this back around to co-production of knowledge, I was thinking of, I had the pleasure of meeting Billy Adams from the North Slope Borough this December, and he told a story about how the North Slope Borough got their Fish and Wildlife Department, I don't know what they call it, but it's their biologists, their natural resource department, back in the 20th century, I want to say the 70s, I might be off on the dates, but the International Whaling Commission told them there aren't enough bowhead whales for you to hunt. Our data says there's only this many, we're only going to allow you to have this really small quota, or maybe they weren't allowing them to hunt at all. And he told the story that people in Utqiagvik and North Slope communities knew that was wrong. And they started their own scientific program, and they collected their own data, and they developed their own population estimates, and they were able to take those data to the International Whaling Commission and assert, this is how many whales there are, and this is a sustainable harvest level, and we want to up our quota, and they were successful. So I think that's certainly not every community has the resources of the North Slope Borough. They are fortunate to have a lot of revenue that comes in from property taxes. But I think, hopefully, I mean, there are people, I guess in my group, we're working with the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission now on a study using environmental DNA where their biologists, their staff at their weirs they filter water samples during the salmon run, and then we measure those filters in the lab to see how much salmon DNA is on there. And we're trying to test this as another tool that they could use to address their own priorities, so they could potentially monitor more salmon runs that pass through more villages without having to build these resource-intensive weirs all over the place, or fly aerial surveys when the weather can be bad and it could be dangerous, or you might not get a good count. They want, if this tool can be proven, they're hoping they can use it to conduct community-driven research on their own priorities, and they could have trained community members to collect valuable data. So maybe that's kind of brings both of these questions or both of these kind of thorny issues and comes up with one solution where if community members are empowered through good partnerships and through maybe the diminishing of institutional racism at academic institutions that have held people back in the past, if we can empower local communities to be able to do their own research and address their own priorities, then they can potentially have more power in the resource management bodies to come with their own data and assert what they think should happen at a policy level.
We're kind of winding down in the time that we had allotted for this session. I want to give the opportunity for our panelists to make any concluding comments that they wish to make, and then we'll wrap up from there. So, any closing thoughts? We've covered a lot of ground, and it's been a fascinating discussion.
I just really want to emphasize, like, thank you for hosting these conversations and this this conference in general, and for the participants that are here and the conversations that we're having. I'm always available, either on the record or off the record, for questions and talk about fish and talk about health. I mean, you can contact me in 1,000 different ways, and I'm around the rest of the week. And yeah, thank you for the questions and for participating and for listening.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I feel like maybe, I mean, there's so many experts and so many important perspectives in this room. Maybe we should have had the chairs in a circle, and I feel a little out of place being behind the podium here, but really appreciate the great insights and the great questions from the group. I'd love to continue these conversations, and I'm super curious. When I feed my kids sockeye salmon that we caught in Alaska, or our friends caught, I feel like I'm fueling them with like the best food there is, and it's going to help their muscles and their brains. And if I feed them chicken nuggets from Costco, I feel like, oh, I kind of failed as a dad today. Or like a cow from the grocery store. You know, it just doesn't feel like a health food to me like fish does. So I would love to hear that. Maybe that's wrong, but I have the feeling that that's probably true if we're like measuring all the right things, the omega-3s and the cultural value and all the nutrients and all the things. So keep up the good work. I'll look forward to seeing the messages come out of the health department on this.
I think a nutritionist might argue.
A nutritionist might argue with me, but I would probably put my name on the line of saying I think salmon is possibly like the #1 best food that we can ingest as humans.
Great comment. Thanks all. Thanks so much. Got a half-hour break now. There's toasters. There's our vendors, and maybe a bag of free for 2 more panels. Oh, and
I just wanted
Louise
to say I
couldn't
appreciate
make it up.
because my question around advocacy. I'm a family doctor, so that's kind of like
Louise
what I
wasn't able to make it up, but she will be here for the film screening at 5:30. Respect for all things, and can answer questions at that time too. Thanks.
It's really hard, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Where do you work?
I work at Canada State Conference right now.
Oh, no kidding. My wife's a family doctor. Jenny Lessner.
Jenny Lessner?
Yeah, she just took it in there too. What's your name?
Elisa.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I love Jenny.
Yeah, we're trying to figure out how to get how can we go to some villages to get her at work, and I watch the kids, and we like hang out, or maybe I can do some like
Well, we can figure out
DNA work or something.
Jenny just started working with us.
Yeah.
A little bit. She runs her own practice, but yeah,